sure that I am not the only one who's seen quite a lot of footage of the 1990s over the last couple of weeks. Obviously, I think most of you will have noticed this. We've had the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. And so there's been a whole lot of reminiscing on the news and documentaries and all of that. But I've been thinking this last week about a really famous moment in the lead up. Well, it was a few years before the Good Friday Agreement. Some of you will remember this. Some of you will remember it from the time. I don't quite. I'm not quite old enough for that. But do you remember Gerry Adams? He was speaking at Belfast City Hall. Somebody shouted something, "Bring back the IRA." And Gerry Adams replied, very famous quote, "They haven't gone away, you know." Well, I can't help but think of that as we read this passage, because it's almost like the writer's telling us the Philistines haven't gone away, you know. Because there's been so much that's happened since they were last on the scene. If you were to imagine the newspapers, the news programmes, they've all been focusing for a very long time on what has been going on inside Israel. All of the focus has been on Absalom and his rebellion and all of the fallout that's come from that. And things have been really hairy for a really long time. And now it's finally starting to look like things might get back on track. And so here's the reminder. They haven't gone away, you know. And so we want to look this morning at the Philistine menace. And we're going to see three things. First thing we see is the enemies of the kingdom. The enemies of the kingdom. And these Philistines were absolutely savage. They were pagans who worshipped false gods, and they absolutely despised the true God. And as well as despising the true God, they hated the true God's people. And we're told in different parts, particularly in 1 Samuel, how the Philistines would come to Israel in their thousands. And they would sweep down on them and they would squeeze the Israelites until they squeaked. In fact, we're told at one point, early on in 1 Samuel, the people of Israel were so terrified of these barbarians who would sweep down on them that they hid in caves and they hid in holes. And we get a glimpse in this passage of just how terrifying the Philistines could be. Because we see that Goliath, who David killed all of those years before, Goliath wasn't the last one of these warrior giants. And so we've got in this passage these massive man mountains. These ferocious fighters. They've got not shovels like hands. That would be ridiculous. They've got hands like shovels. And if they were to get their hands onto your neck, they would just rip it clean off. And everything about these men is big. Their biceps are big. Their weapons are big. And the writer tells us in verse 21 that their mouths are big as well. Because these men just love to hurl abuse at God's people. And so I want you to imagine it. Imagine standing there. Imagine you're an Israelite. Imagine standing, looking up at one of these man mountains. And you feel tiny. You already feel tiny because they're so monstrously big, but you feel even smaller still after they have launched all of these volleys of abuse in your direction. And you can maybe imagine some of the jeers and some of the jibes that they would unleash on God's people. You think of maybe the sarcastic jokes they would make about David's family life. You think of the sneers and the jeers about Absalom and Amnon and everything that happened with that disaster. You think of the biting comments they might make about what David had done to Uriah and what Ahithophel had done to David. You think of how all of those jokes, all of those taunts must have really, really hurt. And then, imagine how easy it would be for the seeds of doubt to take root. Because here you've got these ridiculous physical specimens, and they're bragging about the strength of their country and their army, and then they're laughing at you and your country and all the rebellions and all the crises that have turned Israel upside down. You imagine these men, presumably with their big booming voices, and they're announcing, they're shouting from the rooftops about how Israel is going to crack under the pressure. And you imagine standing there, and you imagine how it strikes fear into your heart. It's a big challenge. Big challenge to stay faithful when all of this is happening. And it's the same challenge that we face in God's kingdom today. Because the kingdom of Jesus Christ has enemies. Enemies who would love nothing more than to smash it to pieces. Enemies who use every weapon at their disposal to bombard the kingdom. They use TV. They use the internet. They use political policies and legislation. They use threats and abuse and persecution and peer pressure and social media and school curriculums. Enemies who despise the King of the kingdom. And enemies who hate his people. And the enemies of the kingdom love to taunt. They love to scoff. They love to jeer and joke, don't they? They love nothing more than to zero in on problems within the church. And then they try to see if they can strike a nerve. They love nothing more than to point out those times when professing Christians have fallen into scandal. And then they use it as a stick to beat the whole church. They love to rub their hands with glee, don't they? Whenever some survey comes out or some census is released and it supposedly shows that Christianity is on the way out. They love to paint caricatures of Christians. They love to make us out to be glum, dreary killjoys, or narrow-minded bigots, or repressed, nosy prudes, or sanctimonious, self-righteous hypocrites. They love to taunt us. And those taunts can hurt. It can be so daunting to see those enemies on the horizon. It can be so daunting to see how influential they are, how strong they seem to be. And yet, we have to face facts. They haven't gone away, you know. They're still there. The enemies of the kingdom. Second thing we see, the weakness of the kingdom. The weakness of the kingdom. So the kingdom seems to be especially vulnerable in this passage. For one thing, David is no longer the warrior that he used to be. You remember what David was like. He used to be this inspirational, talismanic Philistine slayer. He was a machine. He'd go out onto the battlefield and he would wreak havoc. But now, the years have gone by. The beard's gone grey. The hair's got thin. The bones have got stiff. And we see in verse 15 that whenever David goes to battle, he ends up exhausted. There used to be a time when David's name would strike fear into the hearts of these Philistines, but that day's gone. In fact, we see in verse 17 that David ends up in trouble as he goes into battle, and he has to be rescued by one of his own men. And this seems to be a bit of a wake-up call. These men, they know what things were like before David. They know how dark things were in the days of Saul. They certainly know how disastrous things were whenever Absalom got onto the throne. And these men realise that at this moment, everything hinges on David's survival. And as they look at David, as they maybe watch him having to sit down to catch his breath, or as they hear him letting out a big grunt as he gets up again, it would have been so tempting to despair, because everything seems to depend on David, and David is now so weak. And yet, isn't that so often the way it is with the kingdom of Christ? Because the kingdom doesn't always look strong and sturdy. Here we are this morning. We're not a massive congregation. But if you were to go back a few years ago, we were a whole lot smaller than we are today. And I can remember preaching here some mornings, and maybe there were a few families perhaps away for different reasons. It was tiny. It was sparse. And the whole congregation seemed so fragile. That's often the way with the kingdom of Christ. There's parts of our wider denomination that seem very, very vulnerable. There's congregations that are small, smaller than us even. And they've been getting smaller for a long time. There's congregations that don't have a pastor of their own. And honestly, you wonder if they're ever going to have a pastor of their own ever again. There's congregations who have elders who are completely run off their feet because they don't have the help that they need, and the need is so great. Sometimes, sadly, I hear really distressing things from other congregations. I hear about squabbles and disagreements. I hear about rivalries between different families. I hear about bitterness over decisions that have or haven't been taken. And it seems to be a mess. And even more sadly, when you go wider again, when you look at the wider church scene, it can be even more difficult to take. There are, of course, many churches, many fine Christians who are great examples to us. But there are also pastors and churches who are completely caving. They're giving in to the pressures of the world. You do sadly see even entire denominations, and they're being torn apart because maybe a significant group, or maybe even the majority, are turning their back on what Jesus says in his word, and they're bowing the knee to what society says instead. Sometimes we look at the church, whether it's our congregation or our wider denomination or the wider church again, and sometimes we look at it and it looks like David's kingdom in this passage. It's fragile, it's weak, it's tired. It's not what it once was. Well, this passage reminds us of something that we see all the way through the Bible. It shows us that very often weakness is God's way. The weakness of the kingdom. Third thing then we see, the triumph of the kingdom. The triumph of the kingdom. So poor David, he's not physically capable of leading the charge like he used to. You know what? Doesn't matter. Because God doesn't wear a straitjacket. You can't put God in a box. God has got more than one way of working. And we see in this passage the way in which God chooses to work on this occasion is he raises up 4 different men. There's Abishai, Sibbecai, Elhanan, and Jonathan. And these 4 men are going to fight off the Philistine menace, and they're going to save the day. David is a bit of a liability, perhaps. But God is not going to allow David's kingdom to fall. Why? Well, you know the answer if you've been here for the last few months. Because of the covenant. God has covenanted with David that he's going to establish his kingdom, and God is not going to change his mind. And I've said this, I think, every week for the last 5-6 sermons. I'm going to say it again. The centerpiece of God's covenant with David is the promise of the greatest king of all. The promise that one of David's descendants is the one who's going to reign forever. And that means whenever we get to a passage like this, yes, we want to think about what it has to say about David's kingdom, but we need to go further. And we need to ask, what does this passage tell me about the kingdom of Jesus? Well, I want you to go back in your mind to 2,000 years ago, when Jesus was on the earth. Just think of how vulnerable and fragile his kingdom looked. Who were the leaders of the kingdom? It wasn't great powerful generals. It wasn't shrewd strategists. It wasn't influential politicians. It was ordinary, flawed fishermen. Men who got scared. Men who had doubts. Men who were prone to bickering and squabbling and getting the wrong end of the stick. There's nothing impressive about it. Of course, you could say, well, those fishermen, they weren't the real leaders of the kingdom, because really there was one leader, wasn't there? There was Jesus. And he's a different story. And yes, that's true. But if you were to have looked at Jesus whenever he was here on earth, what would you see? Well, Philippians chapter 2 tells us, one with the form of a servant. Isaiah chapter 53 tells us, one with no majesty to attract us, or no beauty to make us desire him. And yes, you would see a man who had electrified crowds. Yes, you would see a man who had performed incredible miracles. But you'd also see a man who was despised and rejected by many. And suppose you'd been there on the day of Jesus' crucifixion. What would you have seen? A man who was absolutely grotesque. A man who was barely even recognisable as a human being because of the beating that he had taken. A man who was humiliated and tortured and looked like he was done for. The kingdom could not have looked more fragile. And yet, was Jesus ever in any doubt whatsoever that his kingdom would triumph? Well, not even remotely. Because Jesus knew that everything that happened on that day, on the day when he went to the cross, was guaranteed by exactly the same covenant that guaranteed David's safety on this day. The kingdom may be fragile, but the kingdom ultimately triumphs. So there's similarities between David and Jesus in this passage, but there's also a really big difference. And I couldn't stop thinking about this from the moment I read the passage this week. It's a really big difference. Verse 22. Now we see that these battles, they were won in David's name, weren't they? But we also know from verse 17 that it wasn't actually David who won the fights. Because David was in the bunker. David was wrapped up in cotton wool. David was too precious to be risked on the battlefield. But not Jesus. Jesus wasn't wrapped up in cotton wool. Nobody stood in for Jesus whenever it came to battle. Jesus never had the chance to stay safe behind the front line. That could never happen. Because only Jesus could possibly stand up to Satan. Only Jesus could possibly strike the hammer blow it was going to take to win the victory. And so I want you to go in your mind's eye to the climactic battle. Young people, you remembered the children's address from last time. The battle when the serpent crusher crushed the serpent's head. The battle, the moment in history that the whole kingdom, and in fact the whole universe, depended on. Where was Jesus? Not in the palace, not in the bunker, not wrapped up in cotton wool, but right there on the front line, hanging from the cross, giving his very life so the kingdom could triumph. These Philistines had great champions. Ferocious, monstrous giants that would fight their battles and smash their enemies and give them the victory. We have a greater champion by far. The one who fights the battles that we could never fight. The one who beats the enemy that we could never beat. The one who set us free. And as we look at the strength of the enemy, and as we look at the weakness of the church, we realise our trust can't be in our own strength, and our trust can't be in any other mere man or mere woman. Our trust needs to be in the Lord Jesus Christ himself, the King of the kingdom, the one who has triumphed decisively in the climactic battle against Satan, sin and death, and the one who even today, 2,000 years on, keeps on pressing home the victory and keeps on giving triumph to the kingdom.